Today's tutor, Alvin Kofi, won his heat on Portrait Artist of the Year, painting film director and musician Don Letts, who chose his portrait to take home.
That feels like me. He's gone 6 inches beneath my skin, so that's interesting. Brilliant.
At the semi-final, his portrait of author Bernardine Evaristo won him a place in the final.
There is this very powerful presence. You know, the hair is just beautifully thought through.
I find watching Kofi painting Bernardine like watching a romance develop.
His final portrait of author and actor Eddie Izzard and his commissioned painting of son Emmanuel completed his journey in the competition.
It's just open and it's warm and it's inviting. I'm really taken with the way that he's used the white. We've never had that in one of his works before, with the backgrounds come through to the foreground.
Alvin works on wood rather than canvas or paper, and he will guide us through his process in today's masterclass, Painting on Wood.
I'm going to share with you today my favourite material to work on, which is wood panel. That will be from preparing your wood to gridding up, putting your first washes on, and then moving to your acrylic washes and then your oil washes. A lot of people use canvas, but I like to work with wood panels because it allows you to kind of uniquely pick out the kind of grain and the texture of the wood to add to your narratives. No two pieces will actually look the same, and it gives you kind of a unique signature to each painting. You can source your wood panels from a local hardware, like a Selco or a B&Q, and they can cut your panels to your size, so you don't get any wastage. The important thing to remember is every panel that you buy will have its own unique texture and grain in the wood. So when you're buying your wood panels, you really want to look at how that's going to contribute to your narrative. The texture of the grain, if it's lighter or darker, you should be considering those in telling the story of what you're going to create onto that panel. Today, we're going to be working with a figure drawing, but we're working landscape instead of portrait. What I have set up here is, first of all, my reference. I've got my panel here. If you're going to consider the type of image that you're going to use, what I tend to do is start off with a thumbnail sketch. And these sketches, they don't have to be too detailed, and I will designate an area that I want to kind of focus on. I've previously laid out my composition onto the panel. Well, what I want to do is really pick up the grain and the texture of the wood. So I've placed the figure onto the panel so I can pick up these textures here and this grain, which I will play with in terms of how I want that image to look. I'm using a grid system, but I'm working not so much to size up, but actually working to create an horizon line, which is in relationship to the image, is cutting through the most interesting parts. In this case, it's the face and the hands. What I would do is then outline the area that I want people to pay attention to. And then where you have the hands coming through, which creates that lovely shape, the line bringing you back up to the face, and this line taking you into this area here, which is mainly on the head. Instead of using a pencil, I'm using a charcoal, because a charcoal you can rub off and take off. So when I'm drawing on the figure, I really want to look at the overall shape of the figure and not necessarily the detail. Looking at our reference picture here, I always work on the outline. You don't have to worry if it's too heavy, because with charcoal you can always brush off, take out. So I'm looking at the blocks of areas which will begin to give an understanding of the main shapes, in this case, the figure. And what you can do with a light brush, you can just brush off those heavier areas. Before I move on to create my first washes, I want to, first of all, fix my charcoal. And that you can do by, I would say, to spray over the whole board rather than just areas, because that means you don't miss anything out. That means that your lines will not completely disappear. They'll disappear just enough so you can just faintly see them, and then that should guide you where you're going to put your first washes on. Now we're going to start with our first stage, which is sanding. And you can sand your boards down to really fine, or if you want to keep that rough texture, you can keep that rough texture in by sanding it and not too much. In this case, I'm using a fine sandpaper instead of a rough, because you don't want to kind of create that scar tissue into the grain itself, which is important if I want that grain to actually appear in the context of the composition or the narrative of the picture. What we will do is sand your board down according to the grain. So my grain is running downwards, so I will sand in that direction. Sand the sides of the boards, because later on you'll get too many flakes on the edges. So we want to make sure that we sand all the sides. And I will go across, so you can see now that the charcoal is actually not coming off. So I can sand right across. Great sound effect. The areas where you want a little bit more detail, maybe you'll sand those areas down a little bit smoother than others. Those sanded areas, the paint will sink into the layers of the board. It will allow me to put more detail on those areas. And where I want the board to kind of more reveal itself, I don't need so much sand in there. Once we've finished with your sandpaper, don't worry if the lines are too faint, because you won't lose them now the charcoal has been fixed. So with your line work, which you can still see, we have our grid pattern that comes through. And what I want to do now is mask off those grid lines to create the notion of the foreground and the background, and allow me to kind of isolate areas where I want to put more detail into those facial features or the hands, etc. And it will allow you to also tell the kind of story to how the image has been built, not just keeping the textures of the wood coming through, but allow the audience or the viewer to understand how that image actually was created and the stages of that creation, because this is a very all kind of organic. So some areas will be finished and some areas will actually be quite raw. So I will start with the horizon line. And I will then cut from that. I use an ordinary scalpel knife for this, a metal ruler instead of a wooden one. And you can decide on how thick you want your lines. In this case, I don't want them too thick. And this is the beauty of when you work on wood, the wood will take those cuts. You don't have to cut too deep. Make sure you have a real sharp blade, a new blade. And hopefully, you take off that first. So that gives my horizontal line. I use the same tape, and then I look at my vertical lines. Again, fairly simple process, right? So what I would do now is work with my first wash. And this is a gesso wash. I pre-mix my washes because if you're working with a collection, it allows you to keep the consistency of the kind of tonal work running through each image. Your gesso acts like a primer to seal the surface, in this case, our wood panel. For my washes, I will start with a 2-inch brush, and I tend to use larger brushes, so I don't want to get into too much details. These are just washes. Literally wash your board, put on the first coat. You can see that your line work is not disappearing because you fixed it. On this area of the panel, I've not really put hardly any gesso at all because I want all that texture of the panel to come through. I will then do a second wash around the areas that which I'm considering more detail, and in this case, around the head and around the hands. Now we finish with our first gesso washes and quicken the process through using the hairdryer, we will move to our first acrylic washes. Today is about how we're going to use the grain to contribute to the narrative of the image that we're creating. And that means working with your acrylic washes to get it as opaque or transparent as you need to. Our first acrylic washes, they become the kind of platform in which I then place my oil washes onto that. These washes don't have to be too thick. They can be quite thin because you're going to build up the layers. And with acrylic, they dry quite quickly. Don't mind if there's a few areas that are thicker, because you can always brush them out with the amount of water that you place onto the pan. I'm bringing in the stencil work now, and that can be added as light or as heavy as you want to. So I've cut out my stencils here, which is a basic pattern, and I can use it in various ways. In this case, considering my composition is landscape, I want to use these stencil patterns as upright shapes. This is a smaller brush that I'm using. Slightly wet the brush. I'm going to have the stencil that will work across the background. And I'm going to brush in that stencil work. Using stencils, this is an artistic preference to me, because when I'm working on a kind of organic surface like a wood panel, it reminds me of how those kind of first ancestral carvings were made. What you'll see in African and Indian culture is that they're often working on wood as carvings or block printing onto wood rather than textiles. And that's why my reference in terms of using stencil work is a kind of more contemporary notion to how you work on the panel in this way, kind of referring to my own heritage and how I bring that into a contemporary expression in terms of my creative process. Once your acrylic surface is dry, I would then look at my tones for my oil washes. And what I'm going to do now is pick up really the nuances and the details in the face and the arms of this figure. So let's change our palette. Looking back at my reference image, I'm going to use a very restricted tonal range. So in this case, I'm using actually a grey oil wash as my base. I'm using like an olive green, and I'm using a burnt umber, and that will act as my skin tones. What I will do is actually I want to kind of create a silhouette. So in order to create a silhouette, I'm using a stencil, which I've pre-prepared. But at home, there are different ways that you can go about it. I would use a projector, but you can also use a tracing paper, trace off the area, the silhouette of the image on the panel, and then convert that to your card itself or paper, or use the tracing paper directly on, because we're not really going to be using this stencil too much. So this stencil will be placed over the image, which is exactly to the proportion of the panel. I'll now use a Stanley knife to cut out that silhouette. This is the area where you're going to do the tonal work for the skin tones and the face. And I cut away that image. Voila. So now we have a fantastic silhouette of our image. Now I'm going to start with my oil washes and a slightly smaller brush, but I'm now going to be particularly paying attention to my reference image, because I'm going to look at lighter and darker tones, but picking up the features of the figure and the face on the hands in this case. So again, nice clean brush into the water. I'm now considering my first tones. So I'm going to work from an olive green. Make sure your washes are not too heavy, because in this case, we can gradually build your layers. And the layers, as you create your layers, it creates more depth to the image, but also adds to your tones and textures. What I'm doing here is just picking up the details in the face. So as the light falls from the right-hand side falling on the face, I'm keeping this yellow area here, this beautiful yellow glow. So that's going to be where the light's coming from. And then I'm picking up the tonal values on the darker side of the face, yeah? In this case, I'm just picking up where the nose lies, comes in here. And again, I'm not trying to create a perfect image. You know, I don't want to get into too much detail. But what I'm doing is I want to create lots of texture and vibrancy and movement in the image. So my brush strokes are down according to the grain of the wood, but sometimes I can work across the grain, and this will give me a direction to create some vibrancy in the movement of the image. So at this stage, you would have intuitively come to a point where you feel that you can't do anything else with the stencil. So the stencil is now ready to come off. Very simple. Think about this technique. I'm quite happy with how the painting is progressing. Now I'm going to consider taking off the first grid patterns that we put on with the tape, and that will reveal to me where I need to now put those details into the face or into the areas of the painting that needs to be brought forth or taken back. So let's do that. Peel back your masking tape, and that will nicely reveal to you the texture of the panel. And you can see how it now begins to isolate an area of the face, which I may now want to put more detail in. So I'm happy with that. That's nice. We're looking good. So I'm going to go back to my washes again and continue to build. Now I still referring back to my reference. I just come across here. You know, in many traditional painting processes, a lot of excess paint is used, but I tend to be sparing with the paint because it allows us to kind of be economical with how we use up materials, not contributing too much to wastage. And it's a beautiful way to gradually and kind of magically to see how your image appears. It takes patience, but as you build the image, it's going to teach you your process. And that process will only be unique to you. And the gestures of the grain will really continually add to how and where you place each mark, each brushstroke that you put onto the painting. At this stage of the painting, I'm going to be considering larger areas that I'm going to block out. That will kind of bring the image forward, and looking at how I can create these contour lines with the horizon lines and the upright lines. So I'm adding now my base background colors, which will be a white, and then using a yellow. These are working in oils for the background. And I begin to now just block out those areas. as the painting starts to develop, it's going to tell you where you want to put those refined details, yeah? But don't go to a smaller brush. Stay with a larger brush that doesn't allow you to get too finicky on the painting. So I'm going to reintroduce some stencil layering to kind of increase the depth and pick out some of this pattern work in the dress. So a nice dark, that olive green. I'll turn my board this way. This is very, very intuitive. You're surprised. The painting is kind of developing nicely. What I may do is kind of pull out the kind of contour of the hair here, but trying to leave the grain and texture of the wood and allow that to kind of filter through the image. So I hope today has really inspired you to work with a wood panel. Go home, take your time, develop your own process, create your own unique signature to how you'd work on this material.
If you'd like to find out more about these masterclasses, go to our website skyartsartistoftheyear.tv